Welcome to episode 37 of the World Builders Anvil. As always, I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram, and today's topic, world building, cultural, and racial links in your fantasy state. Don't know where to start building your fantasy world? Do you need more? Does it make sense? Forget any worries and become a crafter of imagination. This is the place that will help prime your mind. Now, it's time to heat up the forge, break out the mithril ingots and hammer. Welcome to the World Builders Anvil. I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram. Let's sup from the mug of Java and build. Now, when I'm talking about linking together information, I'm not saying go out and create software to do this for you, to where you can easily get back and forth. I use Scrivener. Scrivener's pretty good for doing that. But essentially what I like to do is, when I talk about my basics, where I have states, cultures, religions, races, places, and faces, all those things I have a folder for in my Scrivener file. And within those, I store separate documents that cover different things. And not always separate documents, it depends on how big the information is, but there's definitely multiple documents in every folder, if it's been evolved at all. And so when I'm linking this information back in, I'm linking essentially how impactful the culture or race is on the actual state. So, for example, inside my Scrivener folder, I have a document called cultural links and a different one called racial links. And what those things do is that's where I give the state-specific information that I feel is needed. And it might not be strictly what I've listed here, but this is pretty much, I think, a good starting point for people. So when I track cultural links, what I look at is when the culture first joins the state. So what was the day that culture joined the state? That could be a founding culture, in which case you might not track the date, or it will match the birth of the state. And there could be an X number, an N number of cultures that were part of the state when it formed. The part that will go to what level you track cultures. For me, it's sort of at this ethnicity level, a Slav, a Greek, an Italian, not cultural subgroups within that state. And usually I attach cultural subgroups to a state as well when they exist, because they not only exist within the context of that state. Also, if the culture disappears from the state, and this can happen for a couple different reasons. One, the culture's gone. It's been wiped out by a different culture in the state. The state's gone and the culture's both destroyed. The state goes on, but maybe it's something like in England where you had Angles and Saxons and Vikings and Celtic peoples all in one area, and Welsh and Scottish, which are really Celts, I guess. Irish, those from the Celtic varieties. And there were more types of German tribes that kind of invaded over to the Normans later on. The Vikings I already mentioned. But over time, the idea of those individual cultures started to go away in England, and you started coming up with this new culture called English. So it supplanted the other culture. And it wasn't one day, but, it was probably, let's say, it happened in the middle of England. I'll just make it up. It happened in Mercia. And from Mercia, it, slowly spreads out, and this idea of what English culture is came into being at that point. Before that point, there was no English culture. And the French might argue there's still none, but that's not very nice. And the other thing is, what percentage of the population is this culture? So, it could be 100% one culture. As new cultural groups come in or form within the state, that could also change. Well, from greater than 0 to 100, what percentage of the culture is that? And if you need more specific numbers, like you're doing a video game and the numbers matter, or you're doing a gazetteer type thing when you talk about populations, there are ways to figure that kind of stuff out or approximate it the best you possibly can. I might do an episode on that sometime, but that's really a deeper topic than what I'm getting into here today. Racial links. I don't look at the stuff I did for cultures. However, the link back to cultures for races is, remember, all of my races are linked into cultures. However, not every race that's part of a culture might be part of that state. So essentially what I'll do is I'll take a list of all the possible races human, elf, orc, halfling, whatever you want to call them. I'll look at all of the different races that are available and say, which ones reside here? And if it's all of them, I have them all listed. And if they're not, they're not. And then, much like cultures, I iterate through this process for every culture. Within the state where I'll talk about what are the races linked. And then for each of those races, I will look at what is the percentage of the population for those races. Sorry, I'm discovering a show note error on my outline. It says in the rank. I have no idea what that means. But essentially, setting as cultures is if I have a, X amount of population, so I have X number of people, 72% are dwarfs, 16% are orcs, whatever you want. You fill it out here. Once again, if you want more specific numbers, I will create an episode on that at some point. And remember, for this, as in all my topics really, but this one's exceptionally crucial, this could and will change over time. So if I go look at the Bedrachum culture at 72 Common Era, or if I have a better name than Common Era, or maybe it's 4221, depends on whose counter you use, depends on what the date is. But let's say I'm using a calendar in 72 Common Era. We're making up numbers here. 98% of the Bedrachum culture is human. And 100% of them are all Bedrachum. And there are 2%, 1.5% really, of the population is orc. That might be true at a certain point in the development of Bedrachum, but actually not that way. There are humans and orcs in that cultural group. Humans are vastly dominant. Orcs aren't liked. If you understand the history of that part of my world, you understand why orcs are part of that culture. But the point being, if I go from 72 to 572, those numbers could shift. Or maybe there are now additional races. Maybe there are now elves and dwarfs in there as well. Not saying there are, but there could be. And at some point, my newsletter people will find that out because I'm planning a newsletter where I'm talking specifically about state building and culture building from a specific point of view of the culture that will be in my first book, which I've started working on. Yes. There'll be more information about that later. Very early in the planning stages. But back to the topic, these things do change over time. So you have to keep that in mind when you're building your culture groups. And what I'll usually do, the same thing I do with my maps, is if I need a map from a different standpoint, I'll take the closest map to it and then the closest map past it, and I'll see which one's closest, and I will create a copy of it because there might be things specific to that time period. And that's kind of a pain. I need a better way of doing that, but it's hard to show time on maps outside of a specific time you're looking at. It's kind of like when we talk about the economy. We'll say it's $14 trillion, $16 trillion. It is at that moment that number was recorded, maybe. But 10 minutes from then, it could be twice as big or twice as small. Who knows? These things will all change over time because the people in the worlds continue to live. Now, the rating for this episode is intermediate. The reason I call it intermediate is a lot of people don't have the distinctions between fantasy, races, states, cultures, and that I do. They'll have the Elven Kingdom, the Dwarven Kingdom. If you do that, this is not that important. I think that should be done, but that's my opinion. And when it's your world, you're going to make that choice. And so since I know I'm in the minority of people on how they develop this kind of stuff, at least from what I've anecdotally interacted with. So that's why I'm going to call this one intermediate. The world building task for the day. In your World Builder's Bible, create a cultural links page and for any culture in your story or in your world that you want to. And make sure that it contains one or more cultural or racial groups. So when you're creating your cultural and your racial pages, go in there and just list, okay, there's this many elves, this many humans. There's a percentage. He said if you don't need the full population numbers, don't put them down. But if you do need the full population numbers, put them down. You have to figure that out. The real world task for the day. Start playing out a new story. This is kind of because of the last episode. Start playing out a new story. Create an outline to get you through the first draft. And at some point we'll be putting together probably a checklist for a good outline. If you look at my show notes pages on guardduel.com, you might think I have relatively weak show notes for my shows. But that's really what I operate on when I'm doing these. I'm having a conversation with you. It's unfortunate we can't talk back and forth and make it better, but it would get really long if I can talk to you and get a response from you about it while it's happening. It takes a lot of effort in my interviews to keep them short. So go ahead, create an outline for a first draft, and don't be afraid to put a little more than what I put down for an outline. However, there are certain kinds of things I think you need for a story outline. I like to have, essentially done by chapters and the story arc. And if the story arc goes beyond the book, what's happening to sort of seed that story arc going forward. What's the thing I could take from and use at a later date? Because obviously when you're storytelling, especially I think in the book, you kind of have to tell the whole story. It would be very obnoxious, I think, to have a Lost or a 24 style book series. Maybe that's me, but I would be really annoyed if I read through a season of 24 for the first time in paperback. One, you lose a lot of the inter-commercial cliffhangers, but the cliffhanger at the end of every episode would drive you nuts. So you got to tell the complete story, but you're going to have seeds of stuff that might be showing up in this book. So I want to know where those happen. I want to know the chapters and the spellings for the names of my characters in the chapters of which they appear. And if there are any name places, same thing. Any cultural, anything world building specific, just the names of. So I one, can make sure the spelling's consistent. And two, if I come up with new ones, I can track it here and in my notes for unexpected elements. Because, I forgot to put that one in here. Maybe I have stuff for it or not, but I want to know when and where I start stuff. And that way I always have a simple place to go back and find out how do I spell that name for that guy? Oh God, it was really long and obnoxiously made by me, which is my own fault. But then I have to make sure I spell it correctly, but I can't spell the guy's name. His name is, I don't know what his parents were thinking when they had me name him that, but sometimes, it's just good to have a quick reference back. That way it minimizes your downtime when you're writing later on. And the tease for this episode, world building religions and fantasy states. And as always, make sure to go to gardul.com. That's GARDUL.com for the show notes. It'll be under podcasting, World Builders Anvil. That's a great place to get all of the information from the episode that you've just listened to and to see all the resources that we've talked about in this episode. Thanks for joining us this episode of the World Builders Anvil. Please be sure to rate and review us in iTunes, and please help get the word out to your friends about our show. And join me, Jeffrey W. Ingram at Gardul.com, to see the progress of my world and learn why I made the choices I did. And please contact me and let me know the topics you would love to hear in the future. Now strike, while the myth rolls high.